All right, welcome everybody to the Amberdata podcast, where we explore the intersections of finance, blockchain, and technology. Today, I'm super excited to have Vijay Chetty, the CEO of Eclipse Labs, on the podcast. Eclipse Labs is building essentially a Solana L2 on Ethereum. So the L2 ecosystem is blowing up. It's been a really interesting summer, to say the least, in terms of kind of the modular blockchain explosion between L2 scaling, data availability, and settlement on ETH. Vijay, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So before we get into like the L2 ecosystem and what you guys are building, I was hoping we could kind of just get a quick background on yourself. You have a really interesting crypto resume, but could you kind of give us like your journey into the space, your experience building through the crypto ecosystem, and then kind of what led you to Eclipse?
Yeah. So in a nutshell, I've been building in crypto for the last 10 years or so, which feels crazy to say because just it feels like each cycle is like a decade in and of itself. It's like the third cycle now, but yeah, it's been a blast. I got my start on Wall Street, where I was an investor at BlackRock on the fixed income side. So very much come from the traditional finance world, talking to management, looking at balance sheets, modeling out returns and um, sharp ratios and things like that. And then in 2015, I jumped into the space, first at Ripple. And I think what stuck out to me was just this interesting kind of convergence of three areas I was very interested in. Like first, kind of the markets and finance aspect, which is the part I knew best. And then second is the technical piece, and then the legal and sort of coordination piece, right? And so unifying those three sort of considerations or trade-offs into one system was just super interesting and compelling to me. And it felt like crypto really needed a lot of market structure and a lot of the pieces that you saw in the capital market system as well. So jumped in this space in 2015, spent 3 years at Ripple building things out in the early days there. Totally different time in crypto, right? There were maybe three or four blockchains out there at the time. And then more recently, I've spent the last 4 or 5 years in the DeFi ecosystem prior to Eclipse. So I was leading BD and growth at dYdX and then at Uniswap. So those were great experiences in terms of building out the dYdX ecosystem from day one. And then at Uniswap with helping to launch Uniswap X, which is now powering most of the swapping volume on the Uniswap interface. So we could talk more about that too. But yeah, and for the last year, I've been CEO, previously Chief Growth Officer at Eclipse, and then more recently CEO, and really spearheading things across the ecosystem previously and now managing kind of all parts of what we're doing. And yeah, it's been a blast.
That's amazing. I think it's interesting to see like from experience building some of the, I mean, dYdX and Uniswap and I mean Ripple as well are some of like the most dominant names in the industry and have been. They've kind of like held that space for a long time. And I think when you look at the space from like a technical implementation, they've done a lot of things right. But from like a development ecosystem growth, they've done a lot right as well. And I think it's interesting to see like each of these pieces as a silo. Like if you don't have both pieces, you'll have like a protocol that, is existent, but it's not as dominant as you see as some of these other ones, such as dYdX or Compound or Uniswap, for example. So you've been able to kind of build and grow some of like the largest DeFi ecosystems in the space. We're transitioning into Ethereum's not the fastest blockchain. It's got a lot of deep liquidity, and we're starting to see a lot of fragmentation in terms of the L2 space. So can you kind of give us the segue into Eclipse? Like why this Solana virtual machine, and what is, the SVM compete with compared to like the OP stack or like some of the ZK rollups?
Yeah. Yeah, so for me, it was a very kind of personal journey into Eclipse and the SVM, right? Because I'd spent the last 4 or 5 years building out some of the foundational DeFi apps in the Ethereum ecosystem, or at least Ethereum first. And if you look at the arc of dYdX and Uniswap, very product-focused teams, very substance focused. Came up in the DeFi summer prior to the pandemic, and you sort of had this evolution from fully on-chain market structure to increasingly off-chain market structure, right? So Uniswap started off with the AMM. You had all sorts of interesting, like a Cambrian explosion of AMM architecture, right? And then eventually that transitioned to more of a focus on RFQ systems and best execution and finding ways to sort of convert harmful MEV activity into more productive liquidity for swappers, right? And so that was kind of the advent of RFQ. But as a result, you started to see this progressive movement of the transaction and compute process off chain, and you lost a lot of the benefits of being on chain in the first place, right? So liquidity, transparency, composability. Um, and I think that's something that Uniswap is working through now as well. And then if you look at dYdX, dYdX started off fully on chain, and then V3 had a centralized matching engine using Starkware with on-chain clearing and settlement. And because of this consideration around the noisy neighbor problem and needing the highest possible throughput for especially a central order book for perps, right? We're talking CME level of scale. dYdX almost had to go in the direction of building an app chain, right? And you see that with some interesting app-specific rollups as well from the perp dexes. And so I think it's an interesting evolution, right? It's very organic, but you had this shift from like totally on-chain market structure that was taking advantage of all the benefits of decentralization and being on-chain to now, much more TradFi-like market structure that was more centralized and basically settling and clearing on-chain, right? So to me, that felt like that was a very natural evolution from market structure perspective, but it was straying from why we're building all this in the first place as well, right? And so I think Solana, to its credit, has had that from day one, where you've been able to support multiple perps, dexes, and clobs at scale that can all exist in the same layer because of the power of the SVM parallelization and the SVM's approach to handling hotspots and noisy neighbor problems, which we could jump into. But so that the idea of taking that SVM and settling to Ethereum and then using modular DA to, always ensure you have the lowest cost of posting, that to me was a very solution-oriented stack that was going to enable the next wave of Web 2 scale and Web 2 plus scale apps, right? Which is really kind of the holy grail. It's like, can we facilitate Web 2 or beyond scale with user experiences that are extremely streamlined, but do that in a decentralized and on-chain way. So that was the promise of Eclipse to me, and why I wanted to jump into this space and transition from the dApp side to infra.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think that's interesting, as you mentioned, is like as the space has progressed, so is the need to kind of scale up. Like you couldn't be building Eclipse without DA solutions, without kind of the rest of the ecosystem catching up to where we need to be now. And I think if you look back to the days of like Ether Delta order books, where they were fully on chain, they were almost impossible to use with no volume on chain. Then the AMM kind of solved that problem, but now it's becoming too much of an expense to even operate kind of on mainnet alone. So you kind of have this natural progression into better solutions. And you see that as like the entire market size grows in crypto as well. And so I think as those pieces come together, it's really interesting. The one of the things that you mentioned, and I don't know if this is intentional or if it's just like a coincidence of the best kind of architecture that you guys are structuring, is I think that the crypto has like a very tribal community approach. So you're either a Solana person, a Bitcoin maxi, an Ethereum, person. So, but basically you're kind of picking the pieces, the best pieces, the way that I see it, of each of those ecosystems. Like you have the speed, throughput, and execution of Solana, the settlement and the security of Ethereum, and the data availability at the cheapest cost, and using Celestia. And so like you can be a Cosmo ecosystem maxi, a Solana maxi, or an ETH maxi, but the pieces all come together to make kind of the most organic, unique experience. And I don't know what your what your thoughts are on that. Is that just kind of that's where the best kind of infrastructure approach from your perspective? But I think it's really unique from the standpoint of like a lot of these things are built as an Ethereum L2 focused on kind of like Ethereum tech, as opposed to kind of picking the pieces of the tech that solve the most problems.
Yeah, totally. I think that's something that we'll see a lot more of and have seen this cycle, right? Where, I think there's so much infra focus this cycle, uh, especially with the ratio of like infra focus to DApp focus. It almost feels like so extreme, right? Compared to last cycle, especially, it was much more about the app layer. But I think part of that is coming from this recognition that, okay, we clearly saw some groundbreaking apps, and in order to enable the next wave of apps that can truly reach mainstream scale, like consumer apps,
Mhm.
gaming apps, or deepen apps, and so on, infrastructure really has to take a great leap forward, right? And so I think the two veins that is coming from uh, is one, parallelization in its various forms, right? So whether it's the SVM or parallelizing the EVM and retrofitting it that way. And then the second is modularity, right? And there's lots of different terms and buzzwords for all this, right? Like modular, integrated, and so on. But I think the gist of it is like just being solution oriented. And now that we have unbundled these pieces, you can truly assemble the most interesting combinations of these to be very solution oriented, right? And so at for us at Eclipse, like we very much like are taking this like first principles approach of if you look across the entire stack, what is going to lead to the best developer experience and the best user experience, right? And so from a DevX perspective, that's the stack we've come up with. And I think the SVM, to its credit, really enables a great UX, right? And Rust, of course, is like um, a less accessible development language compared to Solidity. But I think in some ways that's also a natural filtration mechanism where that helps to identify strong developers or best apps because you sort of have this higher bar, right? So it's almost like people who break through that are proven or at a certain level of capability as well. So yeah, I think we're definitely in the stage now where it's much more kind of component based and solution based, and that's something that we very much keep as our North Star at Eclipse as well, where we always want to ensure we're delivering the best experience for developers and users. And it's interesting, I think when we first started, like there was a little bit of people weren't sure how to think of us, right? It's like we're Ethereum aligned, but are we also Solana aligned? Are we competitive with Solana? And I think because Eclipse was so early to this space in general, um, we saw a fair amount of that. And I think now it's like there's much more kind of understanding and recognition of the synergies with both Solana and Ethereum. But at first it was kind of this like Frankensteinian kind of stack, and people weren't quite sure how to think about us. It's kind of funny.
So one of the things you mentioned is like this cycle has been particularly heavy in kind of the infrastructure space. And I think it makes sense because like to get this space to scale, like we can't just do it on the back of what we have. And so you guys are currently in testnet, correct?
That's right. Yeah,
Okay.
complete testnet.
And so I'm just thinking in terms of when mainnet launch comes up, we have a scalable high throughput L2 settling to Ethereum with cheap data availability costs. Now, now comes the part of kind of building the ecosystem on top of Eclipse, right? And so I'm just curious, like, what's your thoughts on that? Obviously, you've done and had like a really interesting and successful career in growth across kind of the DeFi ecosystem. I'm just curious, like, how you're thinking about that. So you mentioned like Rust versus Solidity are kind of two different developer ecosystems. I'm just, how are you approaching kind of the dApp layer on top of the infrastructure as we kind of move out of or eventually move past like the scaling infrastructure into growing these ecosystems broader and broader?
Yeah. So for us at Eclipse, there's kind of two prongs to this, right? So one is you have an established existing ecosystem of blue chip apps on Solana, right? Who are tried and proven across multiple cycles. And a lot of those dApps have been, almost all of them have been focused on the Solana ecosystem to date. And some of the more mature ones are reaching this point where they're interested in growth opportunities, right? So for them, Eclipse offers a turnkey way to leverage their existing code base and product, but tap into an entire ecosystem of new users and new assets, right? And Ethereum's asset base is still an order of magnitude larger than Solana's, and complementary in a lot of ways. And so being able to tap into that is something that we've seen as a motivating point for a lot of the blue chip Solana devs that are deploying to Eclipse. And so that's definitely an early area that we've been focusing on and talking with a lot of the major players in Solana. And generally, I think you see this difference where if apps are kind of earlier stage in their own life cycle, like say they just launched their own token or they're about to, then they want to focus on growth on Solana first before expanding. But it's definitely something that I think the apps and the Solana ecosystem across the board are thinking about. And then the second piece of it is creating an ecosystem of Eclipse native dApps, right? Where we want these developers, whether they be college graduates or former Web2 FANG developers who are coming into Web3, we want that type of audience to be picking Eclipse because it's the best stack from first principles, right? Highest TPS, and that angle is really what we see as our North Star, right? Is maximizing the TPS dimension. We chat more about that, but um, the highest TPS, lowest cost of posting data using modular DA, specifically Celestia, and then you're tapping into the largest user and asset base in crypto on Ethereum, as well as the shared security of Ethereum, right? So for that audience, we want them to pick Eclipse because it's the best from that first principles design perspective. And so that's really where we're starting to expand our focus now as well, ramping up an incubation program in tandem with our venture partners and ecosystem partners. And the goal there is to really enable developers to come in and build on Eclipse from day one, and eventually expand elsewhere as well if that's of interest. But we really think at scale and long term, Eclipse should be able to serve the need of developers from top to bottom in terms of DevX considerations. So those are really kind of the two prongs of our go-to-market approach with developers. And we think, of course, UX is super important, especially as we move towards public mainnet and start to attract retail users. Having a great user experience and easily accessible apps and easily navigable apps is huge for helping to build that community and user base. So that's the other piece of what we're thinking about too.
Interesting. And so I think one of the things that I think is really interesting go to market is you see that the inverse on Ethereum, like the cost to deploy Uniswap to a new L2 is low, right? It's serving a market that lives on that L2, so they have the opportunity to capture that liquidity and be a backbone to a lot of other financial applications to build on top of other L2s. Solana right now doesn't necessarily have that. Most of the development is on Solana mainnet because it can handle this high throughput. It can handle the amounts of volumes that we're seeing. But to your point, like as these protocols mature and there's opportunities to be deployed on other chains or other networks entirely that tap into the liquidity of ETH while still capturing the same development cycle you'd have as an engineer in the Solana ecosystem, you kind of get like a really clear natural progression from the inverse side of like building a Solana dApp that just gets the inverse value of kind of the ETH liquidity and security. And it doesn't necessarily change, but it's just like the opportunity for like a new customer segment as well. I think that's really interesting. And so
Yeah.
you mentioned like the North Star being like high TPS. So can you kind of just discuss more like the Eclipse North Star being high throughput? Is it specific to, are you targeting specific verticals within the ecosystem? I know you mentioned kind of designing with a first principles approach in mind, or expanding kind of the Eclipse native dApp ecosystem. Can you kind of discuss, kind of the holistic view of Eclipse and kind of how you guys are pushing towards that North Star?
Yeah. So for us, the vision is really to be the most performant general purpose L2 and to focus specifically on the execution layer, right? I think with a lot of other existing L2s, particularly in the EVM space, you've had this what we consider to be a really strong focus on maximal trust minimization at the cost of focusing on the differentiating product, which is really the execution environment. So when it comes to block space, the value accruing service is really at the execution layer and optimizing that for developers. And so that's really, I think, the orthogonal approach that Eclipse has taken compared to all the other L2s out there. And we think it makes a lot of sense for us to take that focus specifically as an L2, right? So we can modify the SVM, and as an L2, we can focus on introducing that very optimized execution environment that's maybe even more optimized than what you find on the Solana L1. And in addition, we can provision additional hardware where that hardware is a blocker in order to achieve the order of magnitude type improvements that you can get over Solana and have transaction fees at a fraction of the cost, right? So that's really how we're thinking about things, is to really optimize at the SVM layer and lean into hardware acceleration and hardware software co-design in order to get that maximum TPS possible, right? And uh, scale that is capable of supporting hundreds of very high throughput applications all in the same general purpose L2. So we're not looking to diversify into app specific rollups, though we have that interest in using the Eclipse framework for those. But we think there's a lot of power to creating this shared general purpose mainnet where you can have these hundreds of high performance apps all coexisting and not being rate limited. So that's really where our long-term research direction is going to go. Um, and ultimately, that also means leaning into a more centralized sequencer set, right? So that goes back to my earlier point about we want to lean into what makes Eclipse truly unique, right? There's enough L2s out there that are prioritizing trust minimization and decentralization. But for Eclipse, as the first SVML2 on Ethereum, it makes a lot of sense to focus into what makes Eclipse unique and what is going to allow these hundreds and thousands of developers to deploy Web3 apps at Web2 or Web2 plus scale.
Right. It's interesting because I think like the trust minimized sequencer versus a more centralized sequencer approach. Obviously, like there's the camps in both sides of the world is maximized, maximum decentralization versus sufficiently decentralized to solve the problem. And so I
Yeah.
think it's interesting because there's a lot of pieces that kind of border just enough decentralization that you can get the throughput that you need, that you can get the same UX that you need. And I think one of the things, and I'm just curious your perspective from kind of like having having been across a few different of the ecosystems, like Ripple kind of has a centralized, it may not be as centralized as it's been, but the market kind of has determined Ripple's a generally centralized kind of network. And then as you scale through these, you find the pieces that are, Bitcoin obviously is kind of like the standard of what you can be maximally decentralized, and Ethereum is so, I would say maximally decentralized, but obviously I think people have their opinions. So I think it's interesting to see, and especially as the network design is kind of picking the pieces of each of the networks. Like it's really clever to see like here's the compromise, and I think, and then maybe not necessarily compromise is the right word, but like here's the trade-offs that you can make. And the trade-off is we want throughput and we want, high volume UX. We want, deep liquidity. We want all the things that allow a network to have kind of like the most robust ecosystem. And so I think it makes sense to go that route. One of the things that I was curious, you mentioned it, and I'm just curious if I can draw a parallel to kind of the ETH ecosystem. So focusing on like the development of Eclipse, the network, the growth, kind of the robustness of the ecosystem versus like open sourcing Eclipse as kind of like a an optimism stack protocol. Like you guys want to focus on building this network, not just saying, here's the tech, go run and build another SVM L2 on ETH. Is my understanding correct? Is that a fair parallel to draw?
Yeah, in general, I'd say for the Eclipse Labs team as the development team behind Eclipse,
Mhm.
we're going to put the vast majority of resources into supporting the general purpose L2, right? And so really supporting and inviting developers to come in and build on that shared mainnet.
Mhm.
And the Eclipse Foundation will be similarly focused. But that being said, we have had a lot of interest in the Eclipse framework and stack itself. And of course, now the floodgates have opened and there's multiple kind of SVM players coming out behind us. And so there's been a lot of interest from those players as well as from kind of other participants like centralized exchanges in terms of using that Eclipse framework. And then even beyond that, zooming out, right? We're a part of the extended kind of SVM and Solana universe and ecosystem, and we very much want to contribute to that ecosystem, help drive that forward, and share kind of a lot of the advancements that we're able to achieve. So yeah, we're definitely interested in open sourcing Eclipse as quickly as possible and being able to share what we're building with kind of a broader array of participants as well, right? Whether it's for app specific rollups or uh, uh, other use cases, that's definitely something that we want to support. Um, from a shared sequencer perspective, I'd say that's not something that is on our near-term roadmap, right? There's lots of players who are focused on that and have a specialty in that. But in terms of supporting kind of broader advancement of the Eclipse framework, that's definitely something that we're happy to support as well from kind of an open sourcing perspective.
That makes a lot of sense. So, couple more questions, but I think from a developer perspective, or for those who want to build on Eclipse, like what's the best place to get started? I know you read the docs is always the way to go, but I'm just curious, like how can people get involved and learn more about the Eclipse ecosystem?
Yeah, so we have a very active Discord, both for developers and users. But beyond that, I'd say to definitely feel free to reach out directly to me or to anybody else in the team. We're very high touch in terms of having conversations, evangelizing. That's something that we see as like a very good and important use of our time. So, feel free to reach out to me directly on Twitter at 0x liquidity. And then the Eclipse Twitter is Eclipse FND, and then the Eclipse website is eclipse.xyz, and we have an extensive developer docs there as well. But any of those avenues, we're very much high touch and engaging with developers across the board.
We'll make sure to add links to everything so everybody can check it out directly. So I'm gonna wrap up with one last question that I think just because I think you have such a unique perspective on the entire space coming from TradFi, building deep and seeing some of the major protocols grow to building your own network. Now you're kind of seeing it come full circle. Like BlackRock's building on chain. So where do you see the space growing in the next, call it 2 to 5 years?
Yeah. It definitely feels like, for a while, like the meme in previous cycles always was, the institutions are coming, right? And then at this point where we are, it's like the biggest institution has come, right? And I think we're living in this crazy time right now on multiple fronts. But it's just it's been pretty encouraging to see that from the perspective of just general institutional and enterprise support for the space, right? And I think the beauty about the current state of crypto is that crypto is very much bootstrapped itself, right? And uh, it's been very inwards focused, and there's so much to build and so many users and developers and a variety of audiences that has been enough for the industry. But now you sort of have this tailwind where you also have these large institutions who are coming in, the ETFs that, in many ways have nothing to do with any of the building happening, but help bring a lot more attention, a lot more capital, a lot more mind share, a lot more kind of support from like a regulatory advancement perspective in a favorable way for the industry. So I think it's all been great to see, especially as somebody who used to work at BlackRock on the investment side. And yeah, I think, that's just going to translate. It's going to translate probably more directly into institutional use cases short term, right? Like we're seeing a lot of work in RWAs right now, and that's an area that BlackRock has been involved in early. But I think there's lots of second and third order kind of consequences of that as well. So for me, from a use case standpoint, I continue to be super excited about the blue chip DeFi use cases that have proven themselves, but that infrastructure like Eclipse is going to help advance as well, right? So central limit order books, uh,
Mhm.
intents and RFQ systems, really bringing kind of institutional grade, CME grade finance on chain, um, and continuing that direction. And then beyond that DeFi space, really the areas I'm excited about are mainstream consumer apps, right? I think we've seen some early proof points with Friend Tech and Fantasy Top, but continuing to move more in that mainstream direction with the likes of Farcaster and others. And then gaming and DePIN are other areas I'm super excited about as well, right? These are very kind of product focused areas, and gaming to some degree has been DeFi with the skin on top historically, but I think we're starting to see some really interesting mechanics that tap into the benefits of being on chain. DePIN, some amazing use cases there with Helios and Demo and others. So excited to see these kind of use cases that really require scale uh, to be able to come on chain and to reach kind of mainstream adoption as well too.
Yeah, and one of the things that you mentioned is like as like while the ETF approvals are positive from like a regulatory and kind of a credibility perspective, the actually issuing of assets on chain now becomes really interesting. And I think like the ecosystem or maybe it's the marketing of crypto is that it's so decentralized you can kind of do whatever you want, but it's so interesting that the inverse is also true. You can write contracts and programs to be as restrictive as you want, so you still get the value add of settlement, transparency, throughput with with all the checks that you need. And so I think as the DeFi ecosystem evolves with like the Uniswap hooks and things like that, like you can actually control who your counterparties are in a broader ecosystem of assets you're trading against. And so it'll be a really interesting few years. I definitely agree. But
Yeah.
I really, Vijay, thank you so much for joining the podcast. We'll make sure to add all the links to the notes below. But thanks again. Really excited to see what you guys are building. Oh, one last question. Do we have any dates or timelines for mainnet launch?
So mainnet will launch this summer. Stay tuned for specific timings. It's definitely something we'll post about from the Eclipse Twitter and other channels. But yeah, it should be an exciting next few months for Eclipse.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Vijay.
Thanks, Pat. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.